متوازن خواهد بود.
If the other party honors its promises, Iran will honor its promises. If someday they want to adopt another pathway, the path to other options will always be open to our nation.
What we have done through this agreement, if we can complete it and if Iran lives up to it, we will verify that Iran is not able to acquire a nuclear weapon.
The deal would not shut down a single nuclear facility in Iran, would not destroy a single centrifuge in Iran, and will not stop R&D on Iran's advanced centrifuges.
Well, reaction is coming in from all over for the deal before the deal with Iran. President Obama working the phones, as is Secretary Kerry, with allies and lawmakers. Meantime, there's news from the French about the inside of these negotiations. Israel National News cites the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, who represented France in the nuclear talks between Iran and the world powers, revealing today that his nation had rejected an original version of the deal reached the day before for not being solid enough. France has long complained about these talks, that they were being kept in the dark, and that Americans were trying to, quote, force them to make concessions on issues like the number of centrifuges allowed or sanctions. Interesting. Let's bring in our panel. Syndicated columnist George Will, Julie Pace, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. George.
Well, the question is, why is the president so enthusiastic about an agreement that far falls short of his original aims and would, at the end of 10 years, leave Iran a threshold nuclear power? And I have had an epiphany. It is wrong to compare him, as people have done, to Ahab pursuing the white whale. I think, at this point, Mr. Obama most resembles his predecessor, George W. Bush. Bush had a vision. He was going to plant democracy. There'd be in Iraq, there'd be a democratic infection, and he would transform the Middle East. I believe Mr. Obama thinks he can transform the Middle East by domesticating Iran and bringing it into the community of nations, as he likes to say. The question remains, however, what will the rest of the Middle East say about this? Will the Saudis insist on having the same kind of technologies that Iran is, under this agreement, allowed to keep and to cultivate? And notice that one subject that was very important when this started simply isn't mentioned now, and that is ballistic missiles, which remain completely uncontrolled.
Well, Julie, a lot remains. We played this yesterday from December 2013, the president kind of outlining what he thinks about Iran's nuclear program, and the State Department was asked about that today.
We know that they don't need to have a underground fortified facility like Fordo in order to have a peaceful nuclear program. They certainly don't need a heavy water reactor at Iraq in order to have a peaceful nuclear program.
Isn't it self-evidently true that President Obama dialed back his negotiating posture over the course of these negotiations in order to concede further and further to the Iranians?
Not at all, James. Our bottom lines in this negotiation have never changed. We need to cut off the 4 pathways for Iran to get to a nuclear weapon, and we need to get Iran from currently 2 to 3 months of breakout time up to 6 times that, so to a year, at least a year breakout time under this agreement, and that's what we have done.
Boy, but if you listen to the French foreign minister, it's a different story.
Yeah, I mean, the French, as you said, have been much more stringent on a lot of these provisions than the U.S. and some of the other negotiating partners have been. I mean, it is interesting when you listen to that clip from Obama from a couple of years ago, the tougher line he was even taking there. It is clear that the administration has had to move on some of these key points in order to get a deal. Fordo, Arak, they are still going to exist. If the deal goes through, their purpose is going to change. You know, to George's point, though, I think that George is right. Obama sees the nuclear deal with Iran as something that would not just curb their nuclear program, but then could be the start of a broader conversation with Iran to be able to try to get them to pull back on terrorist activities, their support for different groups around the region. I do think that it's going to be a very tough sell for a lot of these Arab countries to say, trust us, that if we do this deal, it can solve the rest of these problems.
Well, he's already working the phones on that, but on the cell that he has in the building behind us, Capitol Hill, is there enough there to say, you know what, go with me on this legacy issue, and we're going to make this work?
I think the fact that the administration got an interim agreement here that is broader and more specific than a lot of people had expected could help them. I think the fact that Congress is not currently in Washington will help them. It gives them a little bit of time to try to work the phones, to try to get Congress to hold off. But Congress wants to have a say on this deal. They want to have a vote, even if it's just a vote to say we approve or we reject it. They want to have a say. That's going to be tough to hold off.
And that's the other deadline, April 13th, when Congress comes back, because you would think it all starts right then. Charles.
Well, Congress has a good argument. If George is right about the white whale that Obama's after is the domestication of Iran, and it'll pull back on what it's doing around the region, instability, terrorism, etc. It makes absolutely no sense. If Iran is pursuing destabilization and supporting its proxies in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and now in Yemen, under conditions of tremendous economic strain and diplomatic isolation, the idea that when we lift the sanctions, we allow billions of dollars to flow into the Treasury, so it'll be unconstrained, it will double and triple the amount of support it's giving to the Assad regime in Syria, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Hamas in Gaza and Yemen. And it will also be able to invest all the money in the maintenance and the advance of the nuclear infrastructure, which everybody agrees remains intact. And the idea that it will, without isolation, decrease its activities when it is on the threshold of being the hegemonic power in the region is completely contrary to all the evidence on the ground.
Is there a way that this deal, eventual deal, works? That it's tough enough to work, and that the straw man that the administration says that it's either this or go to war is not really the thing, that they can stiffen it enough to make it work, Charles?
There are a dozen reasons why it will not work. It's not just that it will expire, so at best in 10 years Iran will have a huge untouched infrastructure which it can rev up, and remember, it'll have all the revenues it needs and produce an arsenal of nukes. It's not just that ballistic missiles are left untouched. It's not just that the IAEA will not be able to do spot inspections. If you can't do spot inspections, in the statement that we heard yesterday, they'd be allowed to inspect on a schedule. That's absurd. You know, when you were in college and your parents arrived on a schedule, there was a lot of stuff that
I was always in the library, Charles.
I'm sure.
Always.
But your stuff was not out in the open when they arrived on schedule. I wouldn't expect the Iranians to act any differently. And I'm not impugning it.
Sorry, Mom and Dad. Okay, George.
Well, here's the cheerful way of looking at this. 10 years is a long time in the life of nations. Look back 10 years before the Soviet Union disappeared. 1981, it was the peak of the Cold War in some measures. Buy time and hope for regime change. What we did in deterring the Soviet Union. The median age of the European Union is more than 41 years. The median age in the United States is more than 37 years. The median age in Iran is 28 years. It's a country full of young people who are not forever looking westward, going to be content to be governed by these people.
You sound like George Bush. You know, young people, everybody wants liberty, so it's going to emerge in 10 years. There's not a shred of evidence of any of that. And second, the idea that somehow the Iranians are going to abide and hold back for a decade is an extreme assumption when we know that they have cheated at every step of the way, and without spot inspections, they'll be able to continue the cheating indefinitely.
But wait a second, you were one of the people saying that we should have encouraged the protests in 2009 by young people, the Green Revolution in Tehran.
Right.
So you had hope back then.
Well, they were crushed by a regime that has confidence in itself. Unlike the Shah, it didn't pull back and allow a revolution. There has not been any repetition of that in the 6 years. There is no indication that the regime is weakened. And what was weakening it, what might have been the hope of exactly the revolution that you're hoping for, were the sanctions and the collapse of the economy. And that has been undone.
Last word, is there confidence at the White House that they can get this across the finish line?
There's more confidence at the White House now than there was a few weeks ago, I'd say.
After the break.